Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. It's a great evening. I'm honored and proud to be here. My name is Joy Connolly. I'm the Provost and Senior Vice President of the Graduate Center, and I'm also a Professor of Classics. The Graduate Center, as our name makes clear, I hope, is a national leader in graduate education at the master's level, but especially at the doctoral level. As many of you know, we're the home of pioneering research and creative work, and on a week when the Nobel Prize is being announced in dribs and drabs, we're especially proud of being the home of a Nobel Prize winner, as well as winners of the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Pulitzer Prize, and many other like prizes. We're one of the largest PhD granting institutions in the nation, and we're especially proud to rank among the country's top 10 institutions in awarding doctorates to students from underrepresented minority groups. I've been at the Graduate Center myself for a little over a year, having come from an institution a little bit downtown, and I'm very proud to say that no other graduate school in the country, I think, takes more seriously its public commitments, its public responsibilities, and its mission to advance knowledge for the public good. We are a place that values local impact. And every year, this is the best evidence of this, I think, our doctoral students teach more than 200,000 undergraduates at CUNY. So that means we're bringing the very best of research, like what you're about the kind of research you're going to hear about tonight. We're bringing that from the seminar room into every neighborhood of this city. And we're also an incubator of vigorous debate, reflected in our academic programs and in the scores of free public events like this that we offer, and across our more than 30 centers and institutes on top of our master's and doctoral programs, including the Gotham Center, of which you'll hear more in a minute. So I invite you to come back, if you don't already make a habit of it, to come back to attend our public programs, our lectures and events, and be a true part of the center of the conversation on pressing topics of urgent interest today. I'm especially proud to introduce our speakers tonight, and I'll start with our own Mike Wallace. Mike was born in Queens. He grew up in Long Island. He went to Columbia and studied under the eminent American historian Richard Hofstadter. He briefly served as a one-person history department at Franconia College in New Hampshire. I think we all wish we had taken courses in that one-person history department. And he started teaching at John Jay College in 1971. He helped launch, and for 10 years he directed, the Radical History Forum. And in 1976, bicentennial year, he began work on the project that became Gotham. Initially meant to be a history of the United States, reflecting the avalanche of new scholarship that was appearing in this moment in the 70s with the various social movements of the era. But the aim was to produce a new narrative that would be accessible to the public. So with his co-author, Ted Burrows of Brooklyn College, Mike published Gotham in 1998. So what is it? It's a 1,400-page history, a narrative history of the United States from the vantage of New York, a city from its Dutch colonial inception, key to the nation's economy and society and politics and culture, both in the experience of common trends, democratization and immigration, industrialization, different social movements, ultimately globalization, and as a critical gateway of ideas from the center of the core of the city to the wider world, to the developing continents. Mike Wallace was made Distinguished Professor at John Jay College and the Graduate Center in the year 2000, and in that year he founded the Gotham Center for New York City History. He continues to specialize in the history of New York City and the practice of public history, the way we all experience history in museums and films, in theme parks and novels. And I can't conclude my introduction of Mike without mentioning his other books, Mickey Mouse History and Other Essays on American Memory, A New Deal for New York, and A Narco History, How the United States and Mexico Jointly Created the Mexican drug war. The Gotham Center is part of Mike Wallace's rich legacy, only one piece of it. It's the only university center devoted to New York City history, and it does many, many things. I encourage you to look at its website. I could talk about it for a long, long time, but I know you're eager to hear our speakers. I'll just mention it launched the Gotham History Festival after 9/11. That included 100 roundtables and panels and exhibits and film screenings, a book fair, all held at the Graduate Center, exploring New York City's relationship to its past. It sponsors conferences like the Teaching New York City History, which helps K through 12 teachers all over New York State and beyond. It sponsors countless conferences and seminars. It's an incredibly dynamic and productive center, and we're happy to host it here at the Graduate Center. So why are we here then? I mentioned the Gotham Center as part of Mike's legacy and his creations. We're really here, as you know, because you are here to hear this, to celebrate, mark the appearance of Greater Gotham. Greater Gotham is the long-awaited sequel to Gotham. It begins in 1898 with a parade honoring the birth of an urban Goliath, the consolidation of New York City's 5 boroughs into one metropolis, Earth's second largest city at the time. And it concludes at the end of the Great War. These are the years New York City became regarded as the capital of the world. It too is a weighty tome. It's 1,200 plus pages, I believe. So you'll develop your muscles carrying it home. Both of these books, Gotham and Greater Gotham, were 20 years in the making, and Greater Gotham too is a lively, vivid story, often tumultuous, often violent. The book, I want to flag, includes cute and colorful thumbnail sketches, not only of famous movers and shakers like Theodore Roosevelt and Emma Goldman, Alfred Stieglitz, and W.E.B. Du Bois, but also many more people who are all but forgotten today, and this book brings them alive. Brings them back to life, I should say. So discussing Greater Gotham with Mike is Sam Roberts, and we're honored to have him here at the Graduate Center. Sam was born in Brooklyn. He spent 15 years at the New York Daily News, first as a reporter, then as city editor and political editor. He's written for the New York Times since 1983, serving as urban affairs correspondent since 2005, writing the column Metro Matters, which appeared on the front page of the Metropolitan section. Now he writes the Metro section's bookshelf column, and he hosts an hour-long weekly news and interview program, the New York Times Close Up, on our own CUNY TV, which is housed here at the Graduate Center, as some of you may know. And he inaugurated this show in 1992. He's a prize-winning reporter. He told me to keep his introductions short, so I will simply note that, because the list would be too long. He's the author or editor of 8 previous books, including Grand Central, How a Train Station Transformed America, which appeared in 2013, and A History of New York in 101 Objects, which appeared in 2014. We have in front of us 2 people whose work is immensely productive and connects in a unique way to all our lives, or I'm assuming most of our lives as New Yorkers. So sit back and enjoy the evening. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Joy, and thanks to the Gotham Center for inviting us, and congratulations to Mike Wallace on the publication of this second volume in the Gotham series. As I understand it, you have cards that you can write questions on that will be collected at some point. So I will be conversing with Mike for a little while. Then I will take some of those questions, and we will try to get you out of here by 7:45. So at 8 o'clock, you can watch the New York Times Close-Up on CUNY TV. Now, Mike's new book, Greater Gotham, is about 1,200 pages long. It weighs 4.6 pounds, which is 1 ounce less than the original Gotham, and it's worth as much as the original Pulitzer Prize-winning Gotham by the two sons of City University, Mike Wallace and Ted Burroughs. I'll let you know in advance that Joe Berger, in next Sunday's New York Times book review, says Greater Gotham is just as magisterial as the original Gotham itself, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Now, for the uninitiated, the title was not inspired by Batman. Gotham is a real place in England, not far from the real Sherwood Forest. For 800 years, it was the proverbial place where the people deliberately acted so crazy that King John's tax collectors bypassed the town entirely. Now, we don't know whether they were truly crazy or not, but the place inspired the saying, "More fools pass through Gotham than remain in it." That's something we can all identify with. Now, let me start off by asking something about history. I remember Alan Bennett's play, The History Boys. One of the kids in the class is asked to define history, and he stops and thinks for a minute, and he says, more or less, history is just one damn thing after another. So, Mike, why should we care about history? You've devoted your professional life to it. Why should we care?
Well, let's see. First of all, it's interesting. It depends on the history of what, of course. But the history of the city is deeply fascinating. The question is always, what's the relation between the past and the present? And there's the notion that it's like riding a carousel, you know, you learn from the past because the past repeats itself. And if you sort of pay attention to what happened in the past, you'll be better able to do what you're intending to do. I think this is a mistake. There is no such thing as history. History doesn't repeat itself because there's no history. What there is it's not one damn thing after another, but it's my preferred metaphor is to think of history and of time as a river, and that the present flows out of the past. And to the degree that you understand the nature of the currents which are moving from past to present, you get a sense of what the forces are that are in play. I mean, if you think that today is the first day of the rest of your life, and that you can start from scratch, you're going to be in serious trouble, because the past has coercive power. It doesn't determine what happens, but it sets the matrix of constraints and possibilities. And to the degree that you understand those forces which are flowing from the past into the present through you, it enhances your capacity to get where you're going, wherever that is. My understanding is that understanding the relation between past and present is a source of power. Americans tend to assume their favorite tense, usually, if you ask them, is the future, followed closely by the present. In the past, well, it can be a source of entertainment, it can be, but you know, in the end, it's irrelevant. We talk about the dustbin of history. I don't know if they still say this, but one common put down of somebody who is no longer in fashion is, he's history. And I think that's leads to a shallow understanding, and it leads to the possibility of being manipulated. If you're sort of stranded on the surface of things in the present, and you don't understand the degree to which you're shaped and controlled and possibilities offered or denied, you're open to being conned by anybody who's got a good line. So I think it's important to know history, but also, you know, it is entertaining. I hope, in fact, Gotham is, when all is said and done, fun. And it seems to be. I pick up, when I feel sort of anxious about whether anybody's going to like this book or understand, you know, the language, I open it at random to a page, and I read. And my sense of things is that I can't get much more than a page before something made me smile, or even chortle. And as far as I'm concerned, the notion of enjoying this book or enjoying history is vital. Because if you don't enjoy it, you're not going to pay attention to it. You're not going to understand it.
I could vouch for the fact that this is an enjoyable book. I would also urge you, if you were reading Greater Gotham, to go back and read Gotham. You don't have to necessarily read them in order. But one of the delights of the book that I found, and I read Gotham over again when I wrote a little bit about this book and interviewed Mike for the Times in a piece that ran in the Metropolitan section and at nytimes.com last week, was that it is so filled with fascinating factoids. I've been covering New York for, I hate to admit, almost 50 years, and I keep learning more and more, and learned a lot from this book because of those facts and because Mike tells the story through people, and people are just intrinsically interesting. Did you always want to be a historian?
No, I never wanted to be a doctor, but my mother convinced me when I went to Columbia in 1960 that if I was a pre-med and I became a doctor, I'd always have a job when the next depression came, which she was convinced was just around the corner. So I was dutifully taking courses in organic chemistry, and I was hopelessly lost and miserable. I was taking history courses for fun, but they were, just sort of a sideline while I plugged ahead in my medical career. Until Jim Shenton, who was a famous Columbia professor, brilliant, not that he was a great writer of history, but as a teacher, he was incredibly inspiring. And one day he said to me, you can make a living doing this. And this was an astonishing insight. I had never dreamed.
You're one of the few, though.
The sorry state of professorial salaries is another subject, but yes. So the notion that you can make a living doing something you actually enjoy doing is a rarity, and I feel very privileged to be in that position.
You said that Columbia transformed you into a radical historian. What is a radical historian?
Oh, that's a tough question. It depends on the context in which you're having the conversation about radicalism. Radicalism can mean very different things. It ultimately means going to the root of things, getting down to serious ground level. But for me, it was at a specific moment in time that the notion of a radical history emerged. One doesn't want to be stick-figury about this, but if you looked as I was looking from the early 60s back at American historiography in the 1950s, it was a very happy history, and it was a very narrow history. Yes, there were black people in American history. There was George Washington Carver, for instance, who did Peanuts. There were slaves, but they were happy. Women, well, they really didn't make it into the focus terribly much. History was about what men did, what white men did, what great white men did. The history was about politics, history was about economics, statesmanship, and the like. Gay history, the notion that there was such a thing was not in the common basket. And benignity was characteristic of American foreign policy. We only did good in the world. And what happened in the 1960s and 70s, and it started in the 50s, was that social movements emerged which challenged this state of affairs in the present. So the civil rights movement comes along, and these are people who are determined to combat the racist structure of American society. And in tandem with that were historians, black and white, young, involved, in touch, and sometimes activists in the civil rights movement, who desired to put blacks in the past as well as change their position in the present. And much the same thing happened with the women's movement. Suddenly, in the late 60s, early 70s, the discovery is made, oops, we left out half the population. So you put women in the picture, you re-people the traditional narrative, and it raises many other questions. And the same thing with African Americans. So if you include blacks in the story, you're also talking about racism. You're talking about the contradiction between America's profession of liberty and equality and the reality of slavery. And this poses a whole set of conundrums, and historical research is required to sort of sort this out. Same thing with women. It's not just that you're adding people to the picture, although some of that was essential, but that you're now talking about sexism as a phenomenon. But it also opens up all kinds of new areas of historical inquiry: domestic life, sexuality. These were not on the agenda. The Vietnam War resistance movement, in fact, the same people who were doing that were challenging the historical narrative about just unmitigatedly goodness of American foreign policy. And there was an intermediate zone as well. There are institutions of public history, history museums, historic preservation societies, institutions that are tasked with presenting the best scholarship to popular audiences. And these too underwent a revolution of sorts, a radicalization. So colonial Williamsburg, which had boasted that this was the sacred ground on which Jefferson had trod the earth, which was true, suddenly had to answer to black visitors and to historians and public historians, well, how do you deal with the fact that 50% of the population were African slaves? So movies are made, novels are written. There's this tsunami of radicalism. I'm sure you could come up with other conceivable names. I was part of the generation that after it was because Columbia didn't do this in the early 60s. And I was
post-68.
It was post-68. 68 was a radicalization for me. I mean, literally, I was in the middle of my dissertation, and I'd written the first 6 chapters, and then I had to write 6 additional chapters that countered what I had said, or at least added to what I had said in the first one.
What was the dissertation on?
It was on the history of political parties in the United States, and this was partly coming out of my relationship with Richard Hofstadter, my mentor and friend, and eventually co-author. The two-party system was something that was valorized by him. Comity was his favorite word. It kept the United States from being dictatorial or excessively demagogical or whatever. And I had done research in New York City political party and was talking about it in that vein. And then I rethought it and was more impressed, or equally impressed, with the degree to which the two-party system essentially froze out things that were defined as fringes. So abolitionists didn't make it into the picture. Or for that matter, conservatives didn't make it into the picture. So this change in thinking about the past was flowing out of a change of thinking what was taking place in the present. So I wasn't doing this alone, and that's something that I think it's very important to make clear. This historiographical revolution is a generational phenomenon. And there were people at Columbia, there were people at Harvard, people at Yale, people in Ann Arbor, people in universities all over the country who were involved in this process of rethinking. And some of us thought we would organize the process as best we could. So we formed a Radical Historians Organization, and we began publishing a journal, the Radical History Review, and we had conferences that raised questions in the vein of which I've just been saying. And it seemed to me, by the mid-70s at least, that the collective work of people redoing black history, women's history, history of sexuality, history of foreign policy, had collectively rewritten the history of the United States. But no one knew it outside the profession because, in my opinion, what was missing was a overview of the whole, a counter-narrative to the traditional narrative, and one that was written in accessible language, and one that sutured together the work done in this piece and that piece and the other piece, in economic history and political history and cultural history and social history, and made it into a narrative. So, and this was to some extent probably a function of, again, Richard Hofstadter's impact on me. That before he died at the atrociously early age of 54, he was setting out to rewrite the history of the United States from his perspective in a 3-volume general history. And he wrote like a dream. He was a fabulous stylist, one of the great writers in any field in American letters. And I thought, well, I mean, the traditional way of proceeding in academia is you write a monograph, and then you write another monograph, and then you write a somewhat bigger thing, and if you get to the end of your career, you're in a position to write something called magisterial and tackles broad questions. And I thought, oh God, if I wait until then, I might, might drop dead, and then where will I be?
And then where will your readers be?
And well, I had no sense of readers as a possibility at that point. So I thought, better skip the stages and go straight to it. So the notion was, and I enlisted my friend and colleague Ted Burroughs, with whom I'd written, of course, an interminably long article on the American Revolution, 130 some odd pages, in the process of doing a general history of the United States from this new radical perspective. And so we set about doing it. And we worked for several years, and we wrote many hundreds of pages, and we hadn't gotten out of the 17th century. Now, I don't think we were nuts, because what we were doing was setting the U.S. story in an international context, and that meant the expansion of Europe as an empire. And of course, who are we but offshoots of that process? And also, we were interested in the macroeconomic phenomena of capitalism. And one of the things that's happening in this era, the 16th, 17th century, is the transition from feudal society to a capitalist society. So it was in this context that we set out to write what's now happily, remarkably become extremely popular historical theme, to write the history of the U.S. as a capitalist society, not just an economy, but a society. What does it mean to be in that economic regime for culture, for letters, for, well, the whole deal? On the other hand, it was clear that and we were going to do it with footnotes. which was a way of arguing with or for or against certain analytical lines. Very important footnotes can be. They can be afterthoughts and boring and trivial. But the real meat of them is when you say, we're here, we're following X, who argued, and we're rejecting Y. And so we were going to do both a narrative history at the same level as Gotham turned out to be, plus footnotes. And it was clear after a while, we sort of ground to a halt, that this was going to take about 11 lifetimes, and we had only 2 to spare. So after a year of being seriously depressed, I thought, well, let's think about a way out of this. Let's think about doing something more manageable. Only the history of one city, New York, yeah, why not? And we would set it, however, in a national context, in an international context, so that all the work we had done wouldn't go to waste. And out of that came Gotham.
I like footnotes because it allows me to get back into the book all the things my editors cut out. Now, we're talking about your transformation, I hate to say 50 years ago or so for both of us. I asked you a couple of weeks ago, are you still a radical historian? And you replied rather wearily, I did my theory work decades ago. From here on in, it's letting the theory inform, not guide, not dictate. So are you still a radical historian?
But there's 2 elements to this. One of them is really political, the other is theoretical. I spent a lot of time in my younger days studying theory. The philosophy of history, the politics of history. Marx, yes, but a vast panoply. It was a very stimulating period. This was a period when English historians in particular, E.P. Thompson, who was a friend and a model, were breaking narrow-gauge econometric perspectives on history and imbricating culture into them. And we set up a program of forums, sort of like the forums that are done here at the Gotham Center, which are public events where people present the latest interesting work that's being done on New York City history. That was coming out of our radical group, the Radical History Forum. There we invited people working on the U.S. history in general, but also global history, and very eventually extremely well-known historians came and presented their work. But after a certain point, you can't afford, if you're going to be an historian that turns out history, you can't keep doing theory. So I reached a point where I had in my theoretical kit bag a sense of how you went about asking questions about the past, which is, I thought, and what's the important kind of data that you need to answer those questions? And then I said, well, there's a new French philosopher who's just come out with something really, I'm sure, very interesting, but I'm not going to read it. I just don't have time. I'm going to work with what I've got. So in the sense of when I stopped doing theory work, I mean, I'd wistfully look at some interesting books and book reviews, but I had to get on with business. As to whether or not what I produced was radical, I don't know. I mean, basically going to let other people decide that. But I'd say this. One definition of radical history that emerged in this period, Jesse Leamish and others, is doing history from the bottom up. I mean, not only was it that we were going to expand our definition of what was interesting beyond what the notorious dead white guys did, But we were going to re-see that story not by adding people, but by using people at the bottom, working people, et cetera, slaves, seeing the world through their eyes, going to the people, kind of thing that Howard Zinn did splendidly. And it does change your perspective, obviously. It's a vantage point that's very different from somebody who's in a position of power and privilege. But I felt that focusing only on the people on the bottom was as problematic as focusing only on the people on the top. So for me, what was truly radical was grappling with the interaction between them on a crude level, class struggle. But it's not only about struggle, but it's about the relationship between the people who have these different positions in the social and cultural world. And to the degree that you can do that, the result, I think, is radical because it gets to the core of the dynamics that are operating in any particular historical moment.
You also said something that seemed a little counterintuitive, and that is that novelists do a better job at writing history. What did you mean by that?
Well, it meant I was jealous of my wife. Carmen,
who is here
Buriosa,
tonight?
Who's here, yes, wave your hand, who is one of Mexico's foremost novelists and poets and playwrights and so forth. And what I was jealous about was the ability to do what historians have a tougher time doing, which is, in fact, being all-inclusive. The Academy is organized around particular grooves and channels. So there's economic historians, there's political historians, cultural historians, social historians, and so forth. And they develop particular lines of inquiry, and they develop occasionally arcane language, but which is professionally useful. And the thing is that that's not how real people experience reality. All of this happens at once. You're simultaneously an economic actor, a political actor, a cultural actor, a social actor, and the like. And it's not easy to write a history that sort of combines all of those players, whereas for a novelist, that's at the core of their being. I mean, when Carmen writes about the period, she's got a novel called Texas with the Great Theft, which is about a little-known and miniature invasion of the United States by Mexico. She's able to evoke the borderlands between Texas and Mexico in a multi-sensual way. You walk out of there knowing what it smells like, what it feels like, the cultural realities of Indians and Germans and a whole panoply of people. And that's not easy to do if you're doing history. But the goal that I had was to come as close as possible to making this a narrative history that modeled itself on being a novel.
And one of the great things about Gotham and Greater Gotham is that it's so accessible. It is not a dry history. Let me announce again that if you have any questions, please pass them to the end of the aisle on cards or pieces of paper or anything else you may have been given. You mentioned earlier that you started out with an overview of this project, even when it began as a history of the United States. We're now about 40 years later. Is there anything you learned in the research process that caused you to change your mind about things, change your views about things, your conclusions about things from when you started out?
Truthfully, no. But because what I was doing at the beginning was sketching out a very, very broad outline. And for instance, one of the things that I focused on from the beginning as an organizational device for this book, the whole package, was to surf along with the ups and downs of the so-called business cycle. The history of the United States, and only the United States, can be viewed as a big toboggan ride. Boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust. Busts often ended by war. The economy collapsed with deleterious consequences for particularly ordinary working people in 1807, 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1894, 1907. And there are certain similarities in boom time. The minks come out of the closet, there's display, there's creativity, there's commercialism, there's, a panoply of things. And then there's a crash. And what you get is unemployment and homelessness and either depression or resistance. And the 1850s can look remarkably like the 1870s and remarkably like the 1890s. And so in a sense, that's easy. Once you're attuned to that as a rhythm and other rhythms. So for instance, looking at the city's changing position on the planet. I mean, it's not that it skitters around, but it's that it goes from being a Lenni Lenape country to being a pissant little backwater of the Dutch Empire, to being an important provincial port in the English Empire, to being momentarily, until Hamilton sold us down the river, the Potomac River, the capital of the United States, to being, more to the point, the interlink between industrializing Europe and largely agricultural North America, to being a critical agent in the post-Civil War industrialization process, because capital flowed through New York, labor flowed through New York, cultural imports, political ideologies flowed in through. And then the argument is that in the First World War, New York moved closer, much closer, to replacing London as the center of the global capitalist order, a transition that was completed fully in 1945. So, in some extent...
Because, as you write, of both wars.
Yes, exactly. So to write an outline that organizes the issues on that level, in the relation between New York and the country, you can plot them as geometrical curves, once you've cottoned on to your theoretical framework, is not hard. The trick is now filling it in. And if in fact something happens that doesn't fit your schema, you have to pay attention to that and make correct adjustments. Theory never takes precedence over empirical reality, but without theory, you don't know what empirical reality is the one that you want to focus on.
Mike, let me ask you sort of a trick question, if I may. One of the things, as we said, that makes this book so fascinating is that it's a book about people, about New Yorkers who are fascinating in and of themselves. If you could have dinner with any of the figures in this book, Abe Kahn of the Forward, Emma Goldman, A. Philip Randolph, Lillian Wald, Margaret Sanger, and dozens of others, who would you like to have dinner with, and what would you ask them?
There are 1,634 names in the names index of this volume. So it's a banquet of tremendous dimension. And it depends on the day of the week and my digestion or whatever. I think partly because he figured so importantly in this volume would be Randolph Bourne, who was a theorist and an observer of the multinational, multicultural society that had emerged in the United States. I mean, this is a conversation that we take totally for granted now. But Byrne argued, and New York was a primary example of this. New York, I mean, remember, in this period, 1898, 1919, there's an enormous wave of immigration, people pouring into New York City. And they don't pour in one at a time, and they don't all pour in together. They arrive segmented version. They head towards pre-existing geographical enclaves, and those swell, or they establish new ones, particularly once the subway's in place, and you can extend out into the great expansion of the outer boroughs. And these enclaves are big enough to sustain national identities. You can have language, native language newspapers, religious organizations, restaurants, you can, in fact, in Kleine Deutschland before the war and Lower East Side after, you can walk for blocks and blocks and never hear English, never see English signs and the like. Now, this had been a bad thing as far as most people were concerned throughout most of the 19th century, and also the sense that these places were alien and potentially dangerous. When Dickens comes and wants to see the 5 Points, he's provided with a police escort. Something changes in this period, and there's a new appreciation for the diversity of lives inside the city. The guidebooks of this period are boasting about cosmopolitanism. Rome was nothing in its cosmopolitanism compared to New York, So that was already a bridge towards rethinking. What Bourne did is to, and John Dewey, with whom he was a follower and then occasionally in the critic, and Horace Callan, these were 3 people who argued that it's not just a phenomenon, it's not just that there are different places, but that something has been assembled here that exists in very few places elsewhere on the planet, where people of wildly diverse backgrounds are living cheek by jowl, more or less peaceably. It doesn't mean they like one another necessarily, although there's tremendous amounts of interaction, intermarriage between one sphere and the other sphere, and it's a phenomenon. And that people who would deny this by imposing coercive Americanism, as the basically Anglo-Saxon Protestants wanted to do, because they felt this was their city, they built it, which is not true exactly, and it was theirs by right of cultural primogeniture. And they would Americanize the immigrants. They would melt them down, and so they would look like Americans, i.e., look like them. And Bourne said this is a colossal mistake. It misunderstands the contribution in the city and the country to the possibilities of interaction. These are crucibles of creativity. And so one of the tensions that takes place in this period is between to use language that they wouldn't have used at that moment, well, let's say between cosmopolitanism and Americanism. A not totally unfamiliar schema, because of course the people who wanted to remold people, there were extreme elements like the eugenicists who argued you can't remold Polish Jews or Italian anarchists because they're biologically inferior. And the answer is either to sterilize them so they can't reproduce, or probably easier when all is said and done, changed the immigration laws. And this is a period in 1917 where there's an immigration restriction program that includes, it's one of my favorite titles for a piece of legislation, the Asiatic Barred Zone, which included India, the whole Middle East, whatever wasn't already excluded by the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was similarly forthright in its nomenclature. And all of this is going to be exacerbated by the First World War. Now, Bourne is right at the center of this rethinking, and he's an extremely interesting fellow and a brilliant writer, and I suspect would have been a superb conversationalist. So I'd land on Bourne.
Good answer. One of the major themes of Greater Gotham, and in fact where the book starts, is with the consolidation of what became the 5 boroughs into Greater New York. Why were people in business, in government, so intent on consolidation in this period?
I think there's several ways to come at this, but I think the driving force, the people who promoted political amalgamation, consolidation, were the people who were at that moment promoting it in the economic sphere. J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller didn't like each other. They were as chalk and cheese. But they were completely in agreement that so-called free market capitalism was preposterous, dangerous, the pits, bad. Why? Because, and this is from a vantage point in the late 90s, where we're just coming out of the horrible depression of the 1890s, which was known as the Great Depression at that point in the game. Which included vast battles in the streets between police and strikers, the rise of the socialist and populist movements. And they said, competition is the pits. If you compete, then you have cutthroat competition between firms. Your profits go down. If your profits go down, you've got to do something about it. You cut wages. If you cut wages, well, you encourage union movements. If you encourage union movements, you got to shoot them down on the streets. If you shoot them down on the street, this leads to a resurgence of socialism, calling for a replacement of capitalism altogether. Bad idea. So the solution to this is to wring as much competition out of the economy as you possibly can. And between 1898 and 1904, the first and greatest probably still merger wave in American history took place, when thousands of small competing firms winked out and were replaced in the heavenly firmament by hundreds of giant corporations. This is United States Steel time. And these people believed that it's not that they were thinking of being hyper-exploitative. I mean, it's the cartoon version. They thought this was a progressive development, that this would allow long-term planning, this would allow the smoothing out the ups and downs of the business cycle, this would diminish class conflict, this would be good, good, good. And the idea and the cultural meme, I don't really understand meme, but I think I'm using it sort of maybe correctly, that spreads like wildfire is the same approach to competition and consolidation applies in the political sphere. And they said, look at this weird situation we've got. The first largest city, Manhattan and a little bit of the Bronx. Brooklyn is the 4th largest city in the United States. There are hundreds of competing political jurisdictions grouped around the harbor. And when these political actors should be jointly tackling common problems, the port has got all kinds of problems about meeting the change in vessels, the sewage is pouring into the middle of it all. And there's many, many, many issues which could better be solved if they were consolidated. So the people who promoted economic consolidation also promoted political consolidation, and which they won in 1898. There was a cultural component to this too. So cultural institutions, one after another, combined, merged. The Astor, if you look at the pediment of the New York Public Library on 42nd Street, it doesn't say the New York Public Library, or maybe it does by now, but it says the Astor, Lenox, and Tilden Library. And what happened was that these three independent libraries consolidated, merged themselves into one, and then built themselves a magnificent Beaux-Arts building. And that attitude, that cultural good of consolidation was applied, as I go on at inordinate length, in many, many areas of society and culture and the economy and polity.
Were our ambitions as a consolidated city too small? Should greater Gotham, should greater New York have been even greater, encompassing more of the metropolitan area? Would that have been practical?
Well, arguably, it could have consolidated with New Jersey, but that was foreclosed by whoever it was, King James the something or another, who gave away the West Bank to his crony aristocrats, and we've never been able to undo it. Yes, that would have been more rational, but there was plenty room to move into. One of the things that is most important about this period as a function of consolidation is the desire to make consolidation real, not just a fact on paper. And there was a phenomenal degree of building and expanding and the like. So the city connects itself to the country more vigorously by finally coming up with the technology to dig the Pennsylvania tubes, effect transcontinental rail access to what now emerges as Penn Station. Grand Central is refurbished. Docks are built to handle the Titanic-class shipping operations to improve, enhance the connection with Europe. Bridges are thrown up across the East River and the Harlem River, connecting the island economy. The subways, in fact, are absolutely essential to making the city into a mega city. The subway is an agent of population transfer. I mean, the Lower East Side at this point is still the most densely populated place on the face of the earth. And so there's this would-be expanding tendency, but the elevateds were not up to speed. When the subway lines hit the Bronx, like mushrooms up along the tracks, tenements, new law tenements, because there have been changes in the legal requirements of housing construction, explode. And by the end of this period, what was still largely bucolic territory would have been, had it been independent, the sixth largest city in the United States. This is the process of gargantualization. Brooklyn, which was largely agricultural in nature, we tend to forget this. Cabbages are replaced by middle-class enclaves. There's a huge rush, which includes debates over speculators rushing even quicker and buying up land and profiting as the people move into the territory. Also, politicians like George Washington Plunkett, who's seen his opportunity to get inside information about where new subway lines are going, and he runs up there and buys up all the land and sees his opportunities and took them.
I am obsessively over-prepared with questions, but let me take some from the audience. One member of the audience asks, and obviously this would not apply to the bucolic areas of Brooklyn, but can you speak about gentrification from a historical perspective?
New York city, I mean, what eventually emerged as New York City, has been playing musical chairs since the beginning. Well, maybe in the English colonial period. And interestingly, historically, it worked both ways. So you could have the, I don't know what you'd call it, the pulverization dimension of things. So the super gentry area in the early 18th century was at the very bottom of Manhattan, partly because merchants liked to live near where they worked in the South Street, the seaport. And there are still a few remnants of 1790s buildings. The Shrine of Elizabeth Seton is one of them. And it was a wealthy zone, but it was right next to the port. And as immigration expanded and because the public health situation was the pits, disease radiated out from the port, the rich picked up and fled. And they moved up to St. John's Square, which is where Canal Street comes in now, which had a little chapel of the Episcopal Church, and it was a square like Gramercy Park. And then, whoops, the industrial enterprise reaches farther up. Vanderbilt builds a railroad terminal there. We're out of here. And they go up to the next defensible position, which is Union Square, and Tiffany sets up shop on the west side, and all, uh-oh, here come the garment industry. We're out of here, up to Madison Square. Eventually, Central Park is the last stand, and the gentry define a place that they can hold on to. The more familiar one is when you run that story in reverse, and either through coercive mechanisms or more simply through the marketplace, there's this transformation, and I can't tell you how familiar the current debate and phenomena is. It goes back hundreds of years.
Mike, someone asked, what is your writing process like? You spent 20 years on this book, 20 years with Ted Burroughs on the other.
You're talking time, not process.
Oh, process too.
Well, due process. What's it like? It's sitting in front of my computer day after day after day after day after day after day. And there's stages. There's input stage, when, although I've got the structure laid out pretty much, I know what I want to know, and I read, and I take notes, and I take notes in such a way. I set up baskets, literally on my well, not literally, but metaphorically on my computer, so file folders. And I read a book, and it's got information about gentrification, it's got information about consolidation, it's got information about social reform movements, it's got information about the industrial workers of the world, whatever. And I've got a tentative table of contents laid out with baskets for each one of them. And I couldn't have done this without a computer. I don't know how people in the 19th century wrote 18-volume histories. It's just totally beyond me. I'm in awe of their capabilities. But I have a machine assist. So I cut and paste and drop things in the baskets where they theoretically belong. And then at some later point in the process, I turn to the baskets. And the first question is the order in which these baskets is going to be laid out, does that hold up once they're now full of stuff? Because the way I conceptualize this the best, and it's important to know if you're hesitating at the idea of carrying a 5-pound tome, but also actually reading it once you get it home, it's a mosaic. I don't know if it's gorgeous or not, but it's a mosaic composed of tiles. The tiles of the chapters are the actually sections inside the chapters, which are bigger than most people's chapters, and chapters are bigger than most people's books, but this is garrulousness on my part. Earlier in the process, I could still move a tile out of the position that it was in, and this is chronological, basically, and I could move it farther down the road and see if that worked, and then more information comes in, and then I'm getting closer to the ground, and I say, okay, this works. And it better work, because one of the rules of my game is that I never get ahead of the time period in which I am. I never say, oh, you know, this is going to be like gentrification in the 2016. There is no 2016. There's nothing ahead except speculations or desires about what the future may or should be. So once I get to a certain point in the process, if I move a tile to a later period of time, oh, and the other thing is, I always either introduce a person for the first time if they're in a particular tile, or if I don't introduce them, it's because I've introduced them in a previous period. Which means that if I decide to move a tile A from B, C, D down to E, I've got to make sure that I'm not introducing people whom I've already introduced, or if I'm not introducing people who haven't been introduced. Early in the process, that's doable. Later in the process, it's virtually impossible. So it depends on where I am in the timing. Then you get down to, okay, this chapter's a lock. Now I write it. So there's what I call the writing phase. And each of these phases has their own perils and possibilities.
When a chapter is in a lock and you've spent this much time working on a book, what happens when you discover some new fact or some contradiction later on through your research?
You mean after it's published?
No, not, fortunately not, but in the course of the ongoing research.
Basically, the answer is that I crept up on this problem so carefully that it only happened in one instance. There's a chapter there's two chapters. One of them now is called Insurgent Art, and one of them is called Seeing New York. I had the notion of combining in one chapter, and I thought this was really clever of me, not only the novelists, Edith Wharton, the novelists, the playwrights, etc., who are presenting New York in one form or another, with guidebook writers who were in their own way presenting an image and picture of New York. And it didn't work. And I discovered this really late in the game. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? I can't, because otherwise you're talking about renumbering everything, checking all of the tiles. Not possible. But I realized if I simply took the tour guides out of that chapter and left John Sloan and the Ashcan people and Stieglitz and the Armory Show and all of that stuff separate, I could get away with it because I had never introduced the tour guide people in the first place. So I moved them back like 8 or 9 chapters where they formed an interregnum between two different sections, and I looked and it was good.
Mike, I swear I did not save this question for last. But someone in the audience asks, in light of our belated reevaluation of flawed heroes in this country, what should New York City do to revise its honoring of figures like Peter Stuyvesant?
Yes, a tricky question, and an important one. I don't have an easy answer, but I've got some questions. As a historian, what I would like it understood, somehow or another, to maximize the public awareness of the fact, take Peter Stuyvesant. Peter Stuyvesant, who comes in when the place is nearly a disaster zone and whips it into shape, but he needs a basis for the economy, and the basis that he picks is the slave trade. And he does this because he was transferred up, like a branch manager transfer from the Dutch West India Company, from Curaçao. And Curaçao was the center of the Dutch slave trade, the point at which they sold slaves to the Spanish and Portuguese on the mainland. So New York was in fact New Amsterdam was attached to Curaçao and a couple of other islands. It was an archipelago, and it was based on slavery. Now, he didn't stick around long enough to pull it off, but the British certainly did. And by the 1740s, 25% of the population were African slaves. And to the degree that...
In New York.
In New York. And to the degree that people don't know that, and they're living in a kind of mythic world of Peter Stuyvesant, good guy, whatever. But let's go with a tougher problem. Cristoforo Colombo. I would want, at the end of this process of debate and reconsideration, for people to understand why people are complaining about Christopher Columbus. Because most people have in their head a fairy tale. Cristoforo sets off to convince the Spanish crown that they can sail west and wind up in China and the gold and silks and all the rest of it. And he goes to the court and he is told, "Get lost, Columbus, you're a moron, you can't get there from here." Why? Because the world was? Everybody knows, yes? It's complete nonsense. They knew perfectly well the world was round. These people were not morons, particularly people who were on the seacoast. Okay, the first time a boat sails out of Lisbon Harbor and disappears. Oh my God, this is terrible. But then 6 weeks later, they come sailing back. So you do a few of these and you get the idea. Actually, this is preposterous too. The ancient Greeks knew the world. Not only that, Ptolemy, who was the leading geographer of the Greek period, knew how big the world was. So this is hogwash. And there's the various component parts, Isabella hawks her jewels, blah, blah, blah. And then he arrives and he plants a flag on Hispaniola, and that's where most people stop. But the second voyage, he did 4 after all, and when he comes back in strength, is not well enough known, but known to historians. He basically, because he didn't find any gold of a consequence, he rounds people up, puts them in concentration camps of sorts on the beach, and then separates the healthy from the not so healthy, and takes the healthy and puts them on a boat and brings them back to sell in the slave market of Seville, to Queen Isabella's horror, I might point out. Now, what does it mean that, this is a distinguished and sophisticated audience, so I don't mean you, but that we, as it were, as a population, don't know this story? If we take down the statue, or send it to, who was it? Massapequa, some place out on Long Island is offered to house all rejected statues. Like the graveyard for Lenin statues or Stalin statues. Which is not a terrible idea. Gail Collins, your colleague, had, I thought, a hilarious but interesting suggestion that all monuments that are put up have sell-by dates. Right. When they're automatically going to be torn down unless there's some sort of referendum and there's a debate. But if in fact they're just torn down, then the provocation to learn about the story is removed. And it's, on the one hand, satisfying, because we're not down as ratifying. And it's not, it's much less, it's much more complicated than Robert E. Lee statues. I mean, these are, you look at two things. You look at the period in which the honoree lived, and you look at the people who put it up. In the South, the people who put things up, the statues to Nathan Bedford Forrest, are doing this, the head of the Ku Klux Klan, are doing this deliberately as part of a cultural counter-revolution in the 1890s, the early 1900s. There's no ambiguity about why they're doing this. They bemoan the lost cause. They want to maintain white supremacy and the rest of it. That's not why the Italian community in New York put up Columbus. It was to become a part of the New York City quilt. One wins collective cultural presence either by having a parade down Fifth Avenue and a day, so you have a Columbus Day, or you have a statue. And there's political struggles around this question. So the cultural primogeniture people, the Anglo-Dutch community, festoon statues of their story all over the place, the Hall of Records, or whatever it's called now, across from the Tweed Courthouse. When you look up, there's one Anglo-Dutch figure after another. And the Italians, who were largely looked down upon and despised by the cultural primogeniture types, say, well, we're going to have a statue of Verdi, we're going to have, we're going to insert our culture. And the big issue was Columbus, partly because there was a battle. The Spanish wanted Columbus Circle for the Spanish version of this, but they were nowhere near as politically influential as the Italians were. So you've got to assess the motivations behind the erection of the monument, and you've got to look at the implications of having this person honored without understanding the story. So I think, how do you do this? It's not easy. Maybe a video screen. These video things are popping up all over the city now, with subway instructions. You could have, there's a debate over this statue. This crowd says yes, this crowd says no, vote here. I don't know. I think the notion of what de Blasio did to set up a committee, which thank God I'm not on, to wrestle with this, because it's a serious issue, but it doesn't, if the goal is to enhance awareness of the complex and contradictory nature of the New York past, simple effacement, I don't think does the trick, and yet there are grounds for defending that in certain situations.
It's a committee, of course, that will report after the election. As you can see, Mike Wallace is a wonderful storyteller, which is why I urge you to buy Greater Gotham. It is on sale outside the door, and Mike will be there to sign the book for you. Please thank Mike Wallace, and thank you for coming.